Fame does something strange to people, not just to the people who achieve it, but to the people watching. We tend to freeze actors in time. We meet them through a role, connect with a character, and then quietly decide that the actor and the character are somehow the same person. It happens all the time. A performance becomes a memory becomes an identity, and before long, millions of strangers feel like they know someone they've never actually met. For an entire generation, James Van Der Beek wasn't simply an actor. He was Dawson Leery, the hopeless romantic with a filmmaker's imagination, the teenager who treated every conversation like it might reveal some deeper truth about life. The face of late 1990s television introspection. The role made him famous. It also followed him everywhere. That's the paradox at the center of James Van Der Beek's story. The thing that gave him everything also threatened to define him forever. Most actors spend years trying to find the role that changes their lives. James spent much of the next 2 decades trying to prove he was more than the one that already had. And that journey turned out to be far more interesting than the fame itself. This isn't really a story about a television star. It's a story about the distance between who the world thinks you are and who you become when nobody's looking. Because if you zoom out and look at James Van Der Beek's career as a whole, a pattern starts to emerge. Again and again, he found himself confronting the same question. How do you move forward when your past is constantly standing beside you? Some actors fight their most famous role. Others surrender to it. James eventually found a third option. He learned to laugh at it. And that may have been the smartest career move he ever made. James David Van Der Beek was born on March 8, 1977, in Cheshire, Connecticut. There was nothing particularly Hollywood about his upbringing. No famous parents, no built-in industry connections. No obvious shortcut to television stardom. What he did have was focus. People often talk about talent as if it's the defining ingredient in success. But talent is common. Persistence isn't. Long before anyone knew his name, James was already putting in the kind of effort most teenagers avoid. He pursued acting seriously enough to travel regularly into New York for auditions, balancing ambition with ordinary teenage life. Looking back, there's something revealing about that. The entertainment industry is full of people who dream about becoming actors. James behaved like one before anyone was paying attention. Sometimes the future announces itself quietly. In 1998, everything changed. James Van Der Beek was cast as Dawson Leery in Dawson's Creek. The timing could hardly have been better. Television was entering a new era. Teen dramas were becoming cultural phenomena rather than niche programming. Audiences wanted stories about young people that felt a little smarter, a little more self-aware. Dawson's Creek arrived at exactly the right moment. So did James. The performance connected because it never felt overly manufactured. Dawson wasn't cool in the traditional television sense. He was earnest, vulnerable, occasionally awkward, and audiences recognized something of themselves in that. The show quickly became one of the defining teen dramas of its era. Suddenly, James wasn't just an actor working on a successful series. He was a symbol of a generation's adolescence. Which sounds wonderful until you remember that symbols don't get much room to change. Success has a way of narrowing possibilities. The industry usually rewards actors by offering them more of what already worked. After Dawson's Creek became a hit, Hollywood knew exactly what James Van Der Beek was supposed to be. The sensitive lead, the dependable heartthrob, the good guy. And for a while, that's exactly how he was marketed. Projects like Varsity Blues expanded his profile and proved he could carry a major studio film. Yet even then, there was a sense that he was slightly out of sync with the image being built around him. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. He never seemed entirely comfortable occupying the space of a conventional teen idol. Oddly enough, that discomfort may be one of the reasons audiences continue to trust him. Many stars spend years perfecting a public persona. James often looked like someone observing his own fame from a slight distance. And that distance would eventually become one of his greatest strengths. It's strange to talk about James Van Der Beek's breakthrough years after he had already become famous. Technically, the breakthrough was Dawson's Creek. But with enough distance, that doesn't feel entirely true. Fame arrived early. Understanding what to do with that fame took much longer. Some actors spend their careers protecting the image that made them successful. They become caretakers of their own mythology. James gradually moved in the opposite direction. Over time, he started doing something many former teen stars avoid almost instinctively. He allowed people to laugh with him.
Wrong set.
That sounds simple. It isn't. Because when an actor acknowledges that the role which made them famous has become part of popular culture's collective joke, they're giving up a certain amount of vanity. Yet something changed when he did. There was more ease in his public appearances, more confidence, more self-awareness. The pressure to control how people saw him seemed to disappear. Looking back, it feels like this was the moment James Van Der Beek stopped running from Dawson Leery. Not because he finally escaped the character, because he no longer needed to. If you look at his filmography on paper, there isn't an obvious narrative. No dramatic reinvention on the scale of Matthew McConaughey. No shape-shifting career like Christian Bale's. No uninterrupted run of prestige projects. But real lives rarely organize themselves into neat biographies. Sometimes a person's story isn't defined by the roles they choose. It's defined by what happens after a role arrives too early. Dawson Leery entered James's life when he was 21 years old, an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. Millions of viewers answered that question for him before he had the chance to answer it himself. They already knew who James Van Der Beek was supposed to be, or at least they thought they did. And perhaps his entire career can be viewed as a gradual effort to reclaim the right to define himself. Not through rebellion, not through scandal, not by destroying the image that made him famous, but through acceptance, through the realization that the past never disappears. At some point, you simply stop arguing with it. As the years passed, something interesting happened in his work. The need to prove himself seemed to fade. Many actors perform as though they're engaged in a lifelong argument with the audience. Look how serious I am. Look how different I can be. Look how wrong you were about me. That energy rarely appeared in James Van Der Beek's later career. Instead, there was a sense of freedom. The freedom of someone who had already experienced the peak of popularity, already experienced its decline, already learned that neither one lasts forever. There's a certain calm that comes from surviving the rise and fall of public attention. You stop chasing validation because you've already seen how temporary it is. Hollywood doesn't always reward that kind of maturity, but it often makes for a more interesting life. The older James Van Der Beek became, the less he resembled a celebrity, and the more he resembled a person. That may sound like a strange compliment. In some ways, it's the highest compliment possible, especially in an industry built around visibility. His conversations increasingly centered on family rather than fame, children rather than career strategy, time rather than relevance. The things that matter when enough years have passed and enough illusions have fallen away. Somewhere along the way, his priorities seemed to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that generated headlines, just quietly, naturally. Once, he was a young actor known by millions of strangers. Later, he appeared far more interested in being known by the people sitting around his own dinner table. When James revealed his colorectal cancer diagnosis in 2024, many people found themselves thinking about him for the first time in years. Not Dawson, not the nostalgia of late 1990s television. James, the man himself. Serious illness has a way of stripping away everything unnecessary. Career achievements become background noise. Public image loses its importance. What remains is the person underneath. In his public appearances during those years, there seemed to be a different perspective, a sharper sense of what actually mattered. The questions that occupy so much of everyday life suddenly felt smaller. He continued to work. He continued to be present for his family. He continued moving forward as best he could. And perhaps that was when many people finally saw him most clearly. Not as a former teen star, not as a television icon, but as a husband, a father, and a human being confronting something every one of us hopes never to face. The word legacy can sometimes be misleading. It suggests that a life can be measured through accomplishments, awards, ratings, box office numbers, successful projects. Those things are easy to count. The things that matter most usually aren't. For millions of people, James Van Der Beek will always be connected to a specific chapter of their lives. Not because he played the greatest character in television history, but because he happened to arrive at exactly the right moment. The older you get, the more you realize that certain actors become attached to memories rather than performances. They remind us of who we used to be, of what we believed, of what the future looked like from the other side of youth. That kind of connection isn't easy to measure. It's also the reason some performers stay with us long after the credits roll. There's something curious about memory. When people think back to actors they haven't seen in years, they rarely remember specific scenes. What they remember is a feeling. Where they were, how old they were, who they loved, what they hoped their lives would become. For many viewers, James Van Der Beek is tied to memories like that, to a period of life that now feels impossibly distant, to evenings spent in front of televisions that seemed enormous at the time, to after-school hours, to friendships, to first heartbreaks, to the belief that there would always be more time. Maybe that's why his story feels different. It's not really a story about celebrity, or even a story about acting. It's a reminder of how quickly life moves, how fictional characters eventually become real people, and how real people eventually become memories. Somewhere, someone will stumble across an old episode of Dawson's Creek years from now. They'll see a familiar face. For a moment, they'll be transported back to a younger version of themselves. And they'll realize that time moved forward for everyone, even Dawson Leery, especially Dawson Leery. And maybe that's why James Van Der Beek's story still resonates. Because beneath the fame, beneath the television history, beneath all the cultural nostalgia, it was never really about a teen drama at all. It was about growing up, just like the rest of us.